Over the past few weeks, we've been focusing on forest disturbances, and we're going to piggyback on those ideas by looking at specific examples in North America. So, by analyzing tree ring records and tree age records, we can better understand these forest disturbances. So, starting in the West Coast, we'll look at how fire scar records of sequoia forests have helped us better understand these past disturbances as well as these present day surface fire disturbances. Then we'll get into more northern ecosystems from where I'm stationed. I don't know where you guys live, but I live in Buffalo, New York. In more northern latitudes, you're going to have more boreal forest ecosystems. And this next study used tree age records to better understand how these systems interact with crown fires. Again, both in the past and now in the present. Finally, we'll end with these systems that I'm more familiar with, these oak forests. So the distribution of several oak species overlaps where I live. So I actually see a lot of these oaks when I go on hikes. And this study looked specifically at white oaks and how their distribution as well as their reestablishment has changed both in the past and in the present. So luckily I went out to a old growth forest last week in Niagara Falls, just found some really cool individuals and just an awesome ecosystem to be in. Found some really exciting examples, and near the end of this video, you'll see some more footage of those ecosystems. We will start off by introducing these two species that we'll be focusing on, the coastal redwood and these giant sequoias. Now, they are very similar in actually four regards. Both species live in California, both are very large, both are very long-lived, and they are both taxonomically related. These two species are two of the three species in the subfamily Sequoioidae. Coastal redwoods are going to be found, as its common name suggests, on the coast of Northern California in a zone of very rainy winters and foggy summers. Now, the tallest known tree in the world is a redwood that is 379 feet tall. Remember that their absolute height is limited because of this limitation for water to actually reach the tallest parts of the tree. So evolutionarily, selection has favored the xylem in these trees, especially in the uppermost part of their canopy. The xylem is actually very narrow in order to maintain a very negative matrix potential. Remember, that's a little bit of a review from last lecture series. This makes it difficult for the leaves at the top of the tree to obtain water. Now, the giant sequoias are found in 75 groves in the Sierra Nevada part of California. You can clearly see the picture on the bottom left. This is the distribution of the coastal redwood, and you have more inland giant sequoia groves to the right. These systems have snowy winters and more dry summers. These groves are separated by large distances because their habitats are separated by large distances, not because logging caused them to be separated. The largest individual tree by volume in the world is a sequoia, and that is 266 feet tall, but it has a diameter of 29 feet. The rest of this section is going to be about giant sequoias, so we're going to focus more on this inland species. So before we get into these disturbance interactions, I just want to let you guys know I told you in the past that I actually did visit the Muir Woods a coastal redwood ecosystem last year in 2019. This was an incredible, words don't really describe the feeling you get when you're amongst these giants. I literally walked right past my first redwood because it didn't even register that it was a tree. I thought it was some geologic formation. These long-lived species are truly in a league of their own when it comes to their size, and I just want to let you guys know that you guys definitely need to see them with your own eyes. Now, I went to California when the national parks were shut down last year. Um, so I actually didn't get to see giant sequoias, um, but I got to see redwoods and it was amazing. You guys definitely spend your money, work hard, make money, and go travel and see this amazing country that we live in. This is actually my favorite photograph I took from the Muir Woods. These actually aren't even coastal redwoods. I forgot what type of broadleaf tree they are, but you could actually see some coastal redwoods in the background. But I just love this light coming in this photograph. These individuals will never surpass the canopy of those redwoods, obviously. So it makes sense that they're kind of curving towards this open patch. Let's get into the fire ecology of these giant sequoias. So, large fire scars on the trunks of these giant sequoias indicate that fires have been common in those forests at some time in the past. Now, the bark protects these trees, their vascular tissue, both the phloem and the xylem. Again, that's living tissue. The bark actually can protect those tissues, and in some individuals, that bark is up to 2 feet thick. So, thick bark like that insulates the lateral meristem and reduces how much those tissues are heated, and thus reduces the chances that a fire will kill those trees. Now, if we take a look at their cones, on the left-hand side of this left picture, you have that small cone. That is actually from a giant sequoia. On the right, you actually have a sugar pine, a much larger cone. So their cones contain many seeds. They're about 2 inches long, and they're sealed in a waxy substance. The cones can remain closed for up to 20 years. They do open, however, during very hot weather or when heated by warm air that is convected upward from these surface fires that used to readily persist. If the flame, however, comes in contact directly, they will cause the cones and the seeds to become overheated and killed. Now, seeds only establish, we should know what establishment means. It means germinate and become rooted. And they only become established on bare mineral soils in full sunlight. So they can't be around competitors from other seedlings or other species. So fires are 100% required to kill this competition and remove forest litter for the establishment of these seeds. A reoccurring anthropogenic idea that we keep on revisiting is fire suppression. So when European Americans moved to this area at around 1850, they started to suppress fires. Humans, up until more recent times, have always thought that forest fires were a negative occurrence. They wanted to protect themselves, they wanted to protect their land and their potential timber. So what do? We put out all fires to the best of our abilities. So fire suppression starts when these Euro-American settlements showed up, and as we started to put out all these fires, different species started to come in. So the shady fire-free environment actually allowed many white firs to become established. So this understory that usually didn't have many different species, especially white firs, started to change. The composition started to change. Now these systems, they got shadier because fire wouldn't knock back limbs, and you get this invasion of this white fir. Now these white firs, they actually provided ladder fuel. So if you take a look at the picture in the top right, we have a giant sequoia, truly massive individual, and then surrounding it you actually have other conifers. Now these aren't young giant sequoias, these are those white firs that I'm talking about. Now take a look at where the giant sequoia's first branches are. They're actually at the uppermost canopy of the white fir. So you can see that a ground or surface fire is never going to reach the canopy of these giant sequoias without that white fir ladder. So now, because of this different species becoming established, you get a surface fire that will actually climb up the white fir and actually cause a canopy fire in these giant sequoias. So a study published in 1993 by Tom Swetnam of the University of Arizona wanted to better look at these fire interactions in these giant sequoia groves. So research questions included how frequently these fires used to burn and what the cause of these fires was. So for the first research question, how frequently did these fires burn, this information is vital to help create a prescribed burn policy to allow these forests to return to their natural structure. The second part of this question revealed that anthropological studies discovered 70 reasons Native Americans burned forest. Some of these reasons include clearing understory for hunting, creating habitat for plants used to make baskets. Now, 70, think about it, 70 reasons. Those are just two main reasons. Native Americans thus could have caused sequoia forests to have these surface fires in the past. So is this a more natural reason in the form of lightning, or is it Native American interactions? So let's understand how Swetnam actually carried out this study. Let's take a look at his methods. He collected fire scar cross sections from trees in 5 of the 75 known groves of these sequoia trees. Those 5 groves were up to 100 miles apart, depicted in the white map in the upper right hand of the screen. Fire-scarred cross-sections were sawn from at least 16 stumps or logs in each grove. Those fire scars were cross-dated to a pre-existing ring width chronology for giant sequoia. Now, this is extremely important to ensure that missing rings and false rings did not cause the year assigned to a fire scar to be even off by a single year. So, if we actually remember from previous lectures, giant sequoias and redwoods are notorious for having missing rings. They are exceedingly massive, and their pattern is not as uniform as especially other conifers. So if you take a look at this picture in the lower right-hand corner, the largest picture on the screen, it honestly gives me a headache. The different missing rings you're seeing, it's not this uniform circular pattern, and having a chronology already was vital to ensure that you're not off, you're not missing any rings. I just like looking at these pictures. I mean, these individual trees, and this is Tom Swetnam in the bottom left. Look at how large that saw is, right? I mean, these individuals are just, again, in a league of their own. After these data were collected, we finally can take a look at these results. So the oldest fire scar was 1125 BCE. That's over 3,000 years ago. An advantage of looking at these extremely long-lived trees is you can go way back into time to see what the fire ecology was. By 300 CE, all 5 stands recorded fire scars. Now, all 5 groves show the same pattern of number of fire events per century. Most years in which fires occurred, those 2 or more of the 5 groves actually had fires recorded that year. So 60% of the years in which fire occurred in more than just one stand. These data collected here were compared with tree ring based temperature and precipitation records for the past 900 plus years from nearby sites that did not have fires. It was exceedingly important to have a tree ring based climate record to analyze and compare these data with these fire scars, as those fires could influence the ring width in a way unrelated to climate. So you needed to look at trees that were not experiencing fire. The tree ring record of temperature shows that the number of fire events was highest in the warmer years and lowest in the cooler years. So in times of the highest temperature, those time periods had the highest chance of fire. Similarly, when we look at these precipitation records from stands that didn't experience fire, these data show that in years with below average precipitation, there was many groves experiencing fire. Oppositely, in years with above average precipitation, there would be few or no fires. So this year 0 is a fire year. You have the mean precipitation in this red box depicting that in times of low precipitation, you're going to have high number and occurrence of fires. So these fire and climate data are synchronous until these European Americans make their way into these ecosystems and start interacting with them and putting out these fires. In more modern times, we have this interaction with climate change. So after the Industrial Revolution gets started, we have the global temperature increasing, and on the West Coast, this increase in temperature actually increases the number of droughts. So these areas are actually getting drier and warmer, but yet there is less fires than we're actually seeing. So this goes against this synchronicity. And this also suggests that these disturbances were not caused by Native Americans. So if burning by Native Americans was the primary cause, then fires would not have been synchronous between these widely separated groves. Remember, the study groves were hundreds of miles apart, right? So you're not going to have different Native American tribes communicating and burning at the same exact time. This landmark study has supported the use of prescribed fires to remove understory and ladder fuels, as well as opening up mineral soil for sequoia seed germination. To get these systems back to their natural state, we're going to have to utilize prescribed fires. Now, typically, much woody debris must be removed from the base of the trees prior to the prescribed burn. If that's not done, then the fire is going to be too intense, and the heat would actually kill the lateral meristem of the old sequoia trees, causing them to die. So again, that debris must be removed. Now, these pictures that you're looking at are from my really close friend, Eli. He is a part of the U.S. Forest Service, and he is a firefighter on the West Coast. So if you're interested in this lifestyle, he works 6 months a year during that fire season. It is a dangerous job, but he gets around $60,000 a year for just those 6 months, and he spends the other 6 months traveling and like rock climbing and stuff. So if you have any questions on that, I could link you up with him. His Instagram is awesome. These are all his own pictures. And yeah, you can go through his feed for about like 4 or 5 years and see all these different pictures in these West Coast systems. The next study we're going to focus on actually comes from UB's own Dr. Chris Larson. So he wanted to better understand these boreal crown forest fires. Now, these boreal systems, like I mentioned on some of the first slides, are in more northern latitudes. Trees growing here are going to be shorter because of these demanding environments. They're cold. There's not a lot of available water, as most of this water is actually frozen throughout the year. So you're going to have these smaller individuals. This map of fires on the bottom here across Alaska and Canada are from the years 1980 to 1994. And they show that many of these large fires occurred then. Although fires can be very large, most of them are small. And typically the largest 10% of these fires cause 90% of the areas burned, right? So a small number of huge fires actually make up 90% of the area burned. The smallest 90% of the fires only burn 10% of the area. So we're actually going to focus on this study, which takes place in the Wood Buffalo National Park. And you will see this includes some very large fires from that time period. So Wood Buffalo National Park is actually the largest vegetated national park in the world. Half of it consists of wetlands, which are permanently or seasonally saturated with water, and half of it consists of dry uplands. These wetlands actually provide a proper habitat for an endangered bird species known as the whooping cranes. The Wood Buffalo National Park contains the only wild nesting ground for whooping cranes. Their population increased from 17 in 1938 to 442 back in 2015. It's also home to the largest wild population of wood bison. Now, they're genetically similar to plains bison, but they are definitely a lot smaller. This national park is also home to the largest known beaver dam in the world. So you can actually see it's over 1,000 feet long, absolutely massive beaver dam. So the park and its administration was concerned that the fire management policy might have significantly reduced the area burned. They had to put out fires near towns to protect infrastructure and lives, and near the park borders to preserve the value of the forest company lands adjacent to the park. But those needs to put out the fires ran counter to their mandate as a national park to not interfere with the natural processes. So they intervened when they should not have. So Dr. Chris Larson's whole purpose of this study was to see if the park's management was the culprit for the reduced fires that this ecosystem, these boreal systems, are seeing. To carry out this analysis, he utilized these field methods I'm going to talk about next. Number one, a fire history was determined for 166 sites distributed throughout the park using a stratified random manner. Now, I'll go over this in a future lecture, what this stratified random manner actually means and how it can be applied. Number two, fire scars are really uncommon in the Wood Buffalo National Park because crown fires burn most of the forest, and crown fires kill the whole tree rather than just killing only a part of the tree, and that means that the woody material is consumed, so there's no fire scar to be analyzed if the entire tree is burned. So the third thing we need to look at is the time since the last fire. We can only look at the last fires from the oldest trees in a forest. So this was determined by cutting discs from 5 to 10 of the tallest trees are usually going to be made up of the oldest individuals. They need to be cut down for two reasons. You can't take a core because coring doesn't reach the ground and thus misses some years. And coring is also too slow when expensive helicopter time is being used to actually get to these remote places. Since this is a remote boreal forest, the number of trees killed was small and ecologically non-consequential. Almost half of the stands were younger than 50 years, indicating quite frequent fires. Analytic methods include survival analysis, which is used extensively in medical studies. So this is a forest age distribution of these boreal forests with a simulation that's being run, and that simulation shows that 50% of the trees are burned every 20 years. So you get this pattern that occurs. So basically, if half of the forest burns every 20 years, the forest age distribution develops as this. So that 50% then becomes 25%, then becomes 12%, and so on. So look at this table and understand how these age distributions are seen. If 20% of the forests are burned every 20 years instead of 50%, then you get these blue values. So, for example, 20% of the landscape burned in the first 20 years, then 20% of it will be reburned in the second decade, resulting in 80% of it surviving to the next 20 years. 20% of the original 80% is 16%. So that is how you get those values. So again, take a look at this and see the difference between the simulations. If 50% is burned every 20 years versus if 20% is burned every 20 years. So you can literally take these numbers, you can run simulations like this, go into forests and see how many trees, you can see those living trees, how old they are, and what their ratio is within those forests to come up with these percentages to see how often this fire regime actually is. You can better understand the frequency of these fires. So if we take the data from the bottom line of the table and graph them, the forests in which 50% is lost per 20 years would have a steeper curve than if 20% was lost every 20 years. The slope of the line gives us the average fire interval, so note that down. So that means the steeper the line, the greater area burned per fire disturbance. We can see that directly on the graph. This black line has a greater percentage of forest burned every 20 years. So although they have the same frequency of these disturbances, they have a different area burned per disturbance. again, you can easily apply these numbers to see the percent of landscape burned as well as the frequency that those systems are used to. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the y-axis. So the y-axis is log transformed. So without it being log transformed, these lines would be curved, and it'd be much harder to apply these data. So what do we do to make those lines straight? We log transform them. They're much more easy to work with, and we see this throughout several studies. Let's take a look at these results. So the forest age distribution is graphed on the right with the number of years before present on the x-axis. 0 obviously is very recent, and to the right we have more distant time periods. Note that the y-axis is log transformed, making our data more easily observed. Now, the fire interval has certainly changed throughout time. From the years between 1750 and 1860, the fire interval was around 38 years. From 1860 on, you have an average interval of 63 years. So this lengthening of fire interval since 1860, it can't be due to fire suppression, since fire suppression hadn't started since 1950. Now, the lengthening of fire intervals was likely due to a wetter climate developing after 1860. The climate in that area was relatively dry during the Little Ice Age, and that Little Ice Age actually ended at around 1860. So there is some evidence that suggests that in more recent times, since 1950, that the fire interval is actually much longer. But these more recent times, actually, it doesn't differ significantly in our data, so there isn't that much strong of support. So basically, park management is certainly satisfied that their fire suppression efforts in some parts of the park had not impacted the fire interval in the whole park. They thus feel comfortable continuing to fight fires to protect infrastructure and logging lands outside of the park. So by using this age distribution method, they feel comfortable with continuing their suppression of fire. The changes that we see on this figure are not due to fire suppression, but they are due to a changing, more wet climate.
I'm here in DeVoe Woods in Niagara Falls, and this urban forest is actually an old growth forest. There are a ton of really old oaks, and there's 3 species that actually coexist here. There's white oak, northern red oak, and there's black oak. So it's really cool to come up here. It's really only half hour away from UB's campus. You could actually see absolutely massive oak species.
So in this next study, in this North American example, researchers James Wrench, Mary Fajvan, and Ray Hicks Jr. wanted to better understand oak establishment. So here we have the distribution of oaks on the bottom left. They focused mainly on white oaks. As you can see, this distribution overlaps really close to where we live. There are some white oaks. We're on the northern part of its distribution. And these white oaks, they do like open habitats. The saplings survive fires, and basically in more recent times, there has been not a lot of regeneration of these forests. So this part of the lecture is going to dive deeply into this.
Now, since the 1800s, oak establishment has actually greatly been reduced. And I'm actually already seeing signs of it here. There are way more American beech and way more sugar maples growing even in this very forest that I'm in right now. Those two other species that I talked about, American beech and sugar maple, they are more shade tolerant. So that shows us something, that these ecosystems are changing. Before we get into that, we need to focus on the three different types of tree establishment that oaks go through. And we could actually study tree rings to see how an oak was established. So the first origin is a open origin. When an acorn is cached away in an open system, there is all this light available, and those growth rings, it's going to grow rather fast with the available light. Now, an acorn that is cached within a forest, and if that area has been relieved from neighboring species, if there's a gap created by a small disturbance, if a tree is felled by natural causes or human causes, there's a gap in that forest, and that individual is going to have it's going to be relieved from competition during the early parts of its life, and it's going to actually have wide growth rings. As the canopy closes, as it gets older, those rings are going to be smaller. Now, compared to an individual that's grown in a open system, you're going to have a difference in the width of these rings. So interestingly enough, we think that an oak that is growing in an open environment is going to have the largest rings, but this one study that focused only on white oaks, it showed that white oaks that grew in an open habitat actually had quite smaller rings. Their rings were around 2 millimeters thick per year, compared to an individual that grew in a gap, from a gap origin. Those individuals had rings that were around 5 millimeters wide. So an individual growing in a gap within a closed forest actually grew faster than an individual growing in the open. Now, this is a really interesting idea because we think that an open environment is going to make the largest growth pattern, but light isn't the end-all be-all. In an open environment, there's clearly going to be a lot more light, but in a closed environment, in a closed canopy, in a gap, these trees actually grew way faster. Now, that is because the soils from these systems are actually much higher quality. In a gap, from a gap origin, that developing tree is around and has access to much higher quality soil. So we looked at those two types of origins. The third type of seedling origin is a completely closed canopy. So there's no gap. It is constantly, especially throughout its juvenile stage, it is growing underneath the canopy. These trees are going to have very small growth rings, and there are some instances of an individual growing to be really old, like over 90 years, and having a diameter of like less than 10 centimeters. So there can be close to 100 rings. In some instances, you're looking at individuals that are over 100 years old that are the size of this tree. Taking a cross section, you can see these extremely fine rings of a tree that is established in a closed system.
So what this study did to actually answer these main questions as to what is actually happening to oak establishment, they selected 5 old growth forests that contain these white oaks. They cored multiple trees in each of those 5 oaks forests. And then they compared tree age and species to see if there has been a change over time in which species were becoming established in these forests. Finally, they looked at ring widths to see if white oaks had to spend years in the understory before they became a canopy tree.
Several tree ring analyses, they showed that in the 1600s there was a bountiful amount of these gaps in these white oak dominated forests. Since then, looking at these tree rings, we've seen fewer and fewer of these gaps being created. Now, what we're interested in is why. Why are these gaps not being created anymore? And there's actually 3 reasons why oak dominated forests are experiencing fewer and fewer gaps. Again, the main reason why oaks are not establishing themselves as much as they used to is because there's fewer gaps and their forests are shadier and they're becoming more dominated by shade resistant species. So the first reason we're going to talk about is the fire regime. There is much less of a fire regime, especially in this area. Starting in the 1800s, this area was being settled by people of European descent, and all of a sudden, these forests were experiencing fire suppression. These settlers did not want fires to ruin their timber. They didn't want their wood, their possible wood, to be burned up, and they also wanted to protect their homes, their properties, and their families. So they suppressed fire. By suppressing fire, you don't get these gap disturbances, you get a more closed forest. So that's reason 1, fire suppression. So the second reason is that there's much less droughts than there used to be. Droughts were much more prevalent in the 1600s and before that than they are now in this area. On the west coast, not so much, right? There's much more droughts. But in this temperate system where I live in western New York, there is less droughts. We actually get more precipitation, especially in the winter months. So with this, there is less fire yet again. So these first 2 have to do with fire suppression, and then less drought. So the habitats are actually going to be wetter. The third reason, and I think one of the most interesting reasons, is that the passenger pigeon has gone extinct. This bird, it used to flock in the millions. And these individuals would actually eat acorns, especially from white oak. And these extremely abundant flocks would actually land on mature white oaks. And the weight of this flock would actually break many limbs of these mature individuals. Those broken limbs would relieve smaller individuals and create more gaps in these forests. So all in all, I think this is a really good example of forest ecology and how it changes through time. Many times when you have a changing system, you can't just pinpoint it on one factor, right? 3 different interactions are happening that have happened that have totally changed the way oak forests reestablish themselves. So in modern day times, individuals and people trying to conserve nature, they're trying to better the fire regime and allow actually prescribed fires to help maintain these gaps in oak forests. An easier method to maintain these gaps in these oak forests is for loggers to actually prune these trees and simulate these passenger pigeons. Unfortunately, we can't just introduce another bird that hopefully fills in that niche that the passenger pigeon occupied, but we can remove large limbs of mature individuals in these oak-dominated forests to keep maintaining these gaps, to ensure these oak forests continue to reestablish themselves.